Look around at the world for a moment. The price of food keeps rising. Housing becomes more expensive every year. Energy prices fluctuate constantly. Even everyday products seem to cost more than they used to. For most people, this just feels like the normal rhythm of the economy precedes change. Markets move. Sometimes things get cheaper. Sometimes they get more expensive. But very few people stop and ask a deeper question. Who actually controls the price of everything? Because behind the scenes of the modern economy, there is a powerful force influencing nearly every price you see. It affects how much it costs to buy a home. It affects the price of stocks. It affects the cost of starting a business. It even affects the price of groceries and everyday products. And yet, most people rarely hear about it. This invisible force quietly shapes the financial system in ways that most people never notice. But once you understand how it works, the entire economy starts to make a lot more sense. The simple story people are told, most people are taught that prices are determined by one simple rule: supply and demand. If there is a lot of demand for something, the price rises. If there is too much supply, the price falls. That explanation is not wrong. In fact, supply and demand absolutely influence markets. If a city suddenly becomes more popular, housing demand increases and prices rise. If a crop fails, food becomes scarce and prices go up. But this explanation only describes what happens on the surface, because supply and demand themselves are influenced by something deeper, something that quietly determines how money moves throughout the entire economy, something that controls how easy it is to borrow money, something that determines how much businesses invest, something that shapes the financial environment in which all markets operate. That invisible force is the price of money itself, and that price is determined by something called interest rates. The price of money interest rates are often described in very simple terms. They are the cost of borrowing money. If you borrow money from a bank, you pay interest. If a company borrows money to expand its business, it pays interest. If governments issue debt to fund spending, they also pay interest. But interest rates are much more than borrowing costs. They are the price of money in the entire financial system. When that price changes, it affects the behavior of everyone in the economy. Banks change their lending policies. Businesses change their investment plans. Investors move money between markets. Consumers change their spending decisions. And all of these decisions together begin to influence prices across the entire economy. What happens when money becomes cheap now? Imagine what happens when the cost of borrowing money becomes very low. Loans become easier to obtain. Businesses can borrow money to expand operations. Investors can borrow money to invest in stocks or real estate. Consumers can finance homes, cars, and major purchases more easily. In other words, when interest rates fall, money begins to move faster through the system. More borrowing means more spending. More spending increases demand. And when demand increases faster than supply, prices begin to rise. Housing prices rise, asset prices rise, stock markets grow, and eventually, even everyday goods become more expensive. This is one of the hidden ways interest rates influence the price of everything. They quietly shape the flow of money that drives demand throughout the entire economy. The role of central banks, because interest rates are so powerful, they are not left entirely to chance. In most modern economies, central banks influence interest rates through monetary policy. Central banks are institutions responsible for maintaining stability in the financial system. Their goals often include controlling inflation and supporting economic growth. To do this, central banks adjust interest rates depending on economic conditions. If inflation begins rising too quickly, they may raise interest rates. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive and reduce spending. If economic growth slows down, central banks may lower interest rates. Lower rates encourage borrowing and investment. These decisions ripple through the financial system. They affect banks, they affect markets, they affect businesses, and eventually, they affect the prices that consumers pay. How the effect spreads through the economy. The influence of interest rates does not happen instantly. Instead, it spreads slowly through the financial system. When interest rates change, banks adjust their lending rates. Businesses reevaluate investments. Investors shift capital between markets. Consumers change their spending habits. Over time, these adjustments begin to influence supply and demand across multiple sectors. And as supply and demand change, prices begin to move. That is how a change in interest rates eventually reaches the price of housing, food, energy, and everyday goods. The effect may appear indirect, but it is powerful. Why this force feels invisible? One reason this mechanism remains largely invisible is that most people only see the final result. They see rising prices at the grocery store. They see housing becoming less affordable. They see stock markets rising or falling, but they rarely see the deeper forces shaping those changes. Interest rates influence borrowing. Borrowing influences spending. Spending influences demand, and demand influences prices. By the time the effect reaches consumers, the original cause is often hidden from view. This is why many people feel as if prices are rising for mysterious reasons. The underlying mechanism operates quietly in the background. The connection to asset prices, interest rates, do not just influence everyday prices, they also shape the value of financial assets. When borrowing becomes cheap, investors gain easier access to capital. Cheap capital flows into markets. More money enters stocks. More money enters real estate. More money enters speculative investments. This can drive asset prices higher. In some cases, it can even contribute to the formation of financial bubbles. When money is easy to borrow, more investors are willing to take risks. But when interest rates rise again, that dynamic can quickly reverse. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Investors become cautious. Markets can correct rapidly. While this matters for everyone, even if someone never thinks about interest rates, they still live inside the financial environment created by them. Interest rates influence the cost of mortgages. They influence credit card rates. They influence business expansion and job creation. They influence the performance of financial markets. And they influence the purchasing power of money itself. This means that a decision made by central banks can quietly influence the financial lives of millions of people, not directly, but through the economic system that surrounds them. Seeing the system differently, once you begin to understand how interest rates shape the economy, many things start to make more sense. Housing markets rising rapidly, stock markets reacting to central bank announcements, periods of inflation appearing suddenly, financial bubbles forming during periods of cheap money. These events are not random. They're often connected to changes in the price of money itself, the invisible force that quietly influences the behavior of the entire financial system. How interest rates change the behavior of the entire economy. To understand how powerful interest rates really are, imagine the entire economy as a network connected by money. Businesses borrow money to expand. Investors borrow money to buy assets. Consumers borrow money to finance homes and purchases. Now imagine that suddenly the cost of borrowing drops dramatically. Loans become easier to justify. Businesses decide to expand faster. Investors decide to buy more assets. Consumers feel more comfortable financing expensive purchases. When this happens across an entire economy, something interesting begins to occur. Demand increases everywhere at the same time. More demand for housing pushes home prices higher. More demand for materials pushes production costs higher. More investment pushes asset prices higher. And slowly, the price of many different things across the economy begins to rise. This is how a small change in interest rates can ripple through the entire financial system. The global dimension of interest rates, another reason this invisible force is so powerful, is because modern financial markets are global. Money does not stay inside one country. Investors move capital across borders, looking for better returns. When interest rates change in major economies, global capital flows can shift rapidly. For example, if interest rates rise in one country, investors from around the world may move money into that market, seeking higher returns. This movement of capital affects currency values, investment flows, and asset prices across multiple economies. In other words, interest rate decisions made by central banks do not just affect local markets. They can influence financial conditions across the entire world. And that influence eventually reaches everyday prices paid by consumers. How businesses respond to interest rates. Businesses also make important decisions based on the cost of borrowing money. When interest rates are low, companies can finance expansion projects more easily. They may build new factories. They may hire more workers. They may invest in new technology. These investments can increase production and economic activity. But when interest rates rise significantly, the situation changes. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Investment projects that once seemed profitable may no longer make sense. Companies slow expansion. Hiring may slow down, and economic growth can begin to cool. This is one of the main reasons central banks pay such close attention to interest rates. They know these decisions influence the entire economic system. The long-term effect on prices over long periods of time. The influence of interest rates becomes even more noticeable. When borrowing remains cheap for many years, financial markets often experience long periods of rising asset prices. Real estate markets expand. Stock markets grow. Investment flows increase. But if interest rates eventually rise again, those same markets may experience significant corrections. This is why financial markets react so strongly whenever central banks change interest rate policies. Investors understand that the price of money influences the entire financial environment. And when the price of money changes, the rules of the system begin to change as well. Why this force is rarely discussed, despite its enormous influence. Most people rarely hear detailed discussions about interest rates outside of financial news. Part of the reason is that the mechanism is complex. It involves central banks, financial institutions, global markets, and economic policy. Another reason is that the effects are indirect. Interest rates do not directly change the price of groceries or housing overnight. Instead, they influence borrowing, investment, and demand. Those forces gradually reshape the economy, and by the time prices change in everyday life, the original cause is difficult to recognize. This is why the force remains largely invisible to most people. Conclusion: the price of everything in the economy may appear to be determined by simple market forces, but beneath those forces lies a deeper mechanism. Interest rates influenced borrowing, spending, investment, and demand across the entire financial system. Through those channels, they quietly shape the price of almost everything people buy. Most people never notice this invisible force. But once you understand how it works, the behavior of markets and the cost of everyday life becomes far easier to understand, and the economy begins to look a lot less mysterious.